Welcome to this installment of the Division G webinar series. Launched in 2014 by the AERA Graduate Student Executive Committee, these conversations highlight scholarship, discuss contemporary issues, and connect Division G members with the greater educational community. For an archive of our previous webinars, please visit the AERA Division G YouTube channel. Also, be sure to join our Facebook group, AERA Division G students, and follow us on Twitter at AERA DivG. We will be live tweeting, and our webinar hashtag is #DivGChat. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ana Castro, and I'm a third-year doctoral student at Michigan State University. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her, hers.
And I am your other host. My name is Quayling Malone, and I'm a third-year doctoral candidate at New York University. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers.
Today we have the pleasure of hearing from our guests, who are Susan Marine from Merrimack College, S.J. Miller from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, John Wargo from Boston College. We also we hear from Z. Nicolazzo, who is at the University of Arizona. So today's conversation will take up the work of these scholars, their ideas for a more inclusive research, teaching, and activism agenda in solidarity with LGBTQIA+ communities and individuals. We will cover several topics, as many as the time will allow, and that includes language use, learning resources, and the conduct of research on sex and gender. We thank all of you so much for joining us, and especially our hosts, our guests rather. And now I'll hand it over to Quayling for some questions.
Thank you, Eliana. And thank you again to our guests for being here today. So we're going to begin by asking you all a few questions. If you all in the audience have a question, please type it in the Zoom chat box, and we'll hope to get to that at the end. So our first question for our special guest today is, tell us about your work and how you came to it. So whoever wants to start first.
Hi, my name's John. Like our wonderful host said, I teach at Boston College. I'm an assistant professor of literacy. And broadly, my work is sort of located at these axes of literacy, technology, and the social context of education. So I look primarily at historically minoritized children and youth, LGBTQIA youth, and gender non-binary children in particular. And I think about the ways in which they mobilize writing as a means of designing more just social futures. And so this has looked at a variety of means of expressions of writing, like selfies, social media, and recently around sort of questions of what it means to be a community member through literacy learning. My work, like I'm sure most here, has emerged through personal experience. I was a primary grades educator in Denver Public Schools, and helped coordinate the Gay Straight Alliance across the street at the high school. And this really sustained me. This sort of mobilized an interest in gender studies. That was my undergraduate degree at Indiana University. I sort of grew up gay in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. And so I came to my own research, but to graduate school in particular with questions concerning gender equity, identity, desire, and how these sort of made manifest and played out in urban education. So I think, to be brief, my work, like I think many of us, sort of started with stories of self and then led into problems of practice with a sort of interest in LGBTQIA issues.
Thanks, John. That's a great start. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Marine. I'm delighted to be here today. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm excited to be part of this conversation. I think my interest in this work stemmed also from my life history. Prior to becoming a faculty member about 8 years ago, I was a full-time student affairs professional, and I worked for about 17 years in different capacities across 4 different institutions. But my work always kind of came back to and centered around gender equity work, and I spent the bulk of my career doing sexual violence prevention and advocacy. And through that process of working with and supporting student survivors, one of the things that became abundantly clear to me in that work was that we were missing a lot of important understanding and knowledge and content and advocacy around serving LGBT, trans, and queer folk particularly well in that realm of higher education, and in really so many others. And so as I came up through this sort of career progression in student affairs, I began to look around and realize that we had many areas of student affairs work that were missing attention to both sex and gender and sexual orientation diversity. So I decided when I became a faculty member that I wanted that to be the focus of my career. Ironically, like John, I also grew up gay in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. We could have some interesting conversations about that. But I think being a queer out student affairs professional and now faculty member inevitably shapes the work I do every day and forces me to think about safety and agency, both through the lens of my own eyes, but also to then really work hard to step out of that and see it through my students and my colleagues' eyes as well. So again, I'm just really happy to be part of this conversation and looking forward to learning from everyone here.
Hi, my pronouns are, I don't use pronouns. I'm a-pronounced. I was a high school English teacher in Santa Fe, New Mexico for about 8 years, and I was working with a triad of indigenous, it was Latin American at the time, now it would be Latinx, and white students. And I was seeing a lot of students in grief and pain, especially because of a language arts classroom. It tends to evoke a lot of emotion and empathy. And I started listening to their stories, and more of my students were coming out as queer, and I started the Gay Straight Alliance in northern New Mexico. And at the time, I identified as genderqueer. I really didn't have the language for it, or kind of a sense of my own sexual orientation. I thought at the time that I was a butch dyke. I just really didn't know who I was. And graduate school, as many of us know, really disrupted my thinking around gender without me even realizing it. And I went off to live in Pittsburgh for the past 7 years prior to being in New York and Boulder. And I started really listening to the stories of the youth that I was working with in Pittsburgh. And at the time, I was really questioning my own identity. And I kept hearing a lot of young trans kids talking and speaking out. And it gave me language. It gave me identity. And I really attribute my own development as a person to the young people I was working with, because actually there's a really strong, vibrant trans community in Pittsburgh and trans doctors. And it was through the students that I came to recognize who I really was. It was never my sexuality. It was my gender identity. And that really became my springboard. I was doing mostly social justice work with my student teachers. And then what happened is it started kind of narrowing and pivoting towards work around gender identity. So at this point in my career, as a trans Jew, which has never been so important to me in my life, for reasons everybody knows right now, I've been doing more and more research about disrupting epistemological, heteronormative, even intersectional frameworks, because I find that intersectionality actually collapses identities in kind of a narrower way. I respect Crenshaw's work. I respect people whose work is around intersectionality. But trans to me is a constant refiguration and an indeterminacy. And there's the only predictability in that epistemology is that there's no predictability. And so the work I've been doing is how to generate theory around what I call transdisciplinary, transrhizomatic. And it doesn't mean transgender. It means the constant reintegration of new ideas and new concepts. And I've been writing extensively about that. And I'm about to give an national TED Talk. It's in 2 weeks on gender identity. And it's the first of its kind that integrates public health, medicine, and education. So I'm really excited to get the work out there. It's never been, I think, so important as to right now. And that's about it.
Outstanding, Dr. Miller. Thank you. We're looking forward to that TED Talk.
Oh, and my title currently, I'm directing the English education program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior, I was at NYU as Deputy Director of the Metro Center with David Kirkland.
So I'm Z. Nicolazzo. I'm an assistant professor of trans studies and education at the University of Arizona. I teach out of the Center for the Study of Higher Education. I'm also a faculty member in the Trans Studies Initiative, which is the first interdisciplinary initiative of its kind in the United States to bring together trans scholars to think about what trans is and can be in a disciplinary way, as well as superseding disciplines. The work that I do is largely focused on transgender college students, although I have been doing some work with and alongside of transgender faculty members recently. But effectively what I'm looking to do is to think about institutions of higher education through cultural perspectives. So thinking about how does the gender operates and mediates experiences and ways of being and thinking on college campuses. I've also done some work thinking about trans epistemologies and methodologies as well.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so our next question, we're thinking as, many of us are, scholars, are emerging scholars, and just to kind of take it back a little bit, like baby steps, to think about what are some of the terms, terminology that we should be using to address the LGBTQI community, non-binary community. So what are some of those sex and gender related terms that are notations that you use, trans, cisgender, non-binary? Do you employ or avoid in writing, in your writing or speech?
I am moving more and more away from using the word transgender because I feel like transgender, it has been collapsed into female to male or male to female, which has now become part of the binary. For a while, I started writing LGB with the T tipping off. It's really hard to get that on a Microsoft Word document, but at least by handwriting and the work I do with my pre-service teachers to really demonstrate that it needs to be separated. But I'm working with a notion of gender identity complexity or complex gender identities, and I'm using that phrase. It's not that transgender, and all the terminology don't matter and should not matter. But in my own personal way, I feel like identities are constantly, they're indeterminate. I have a student in my study who identifies as an emoji, right? And so how do pre-service teachers recognize emojis in the classroom? And what does a student use emoji pronouns? Are there pronouns? So it's always allowing for that space to constantly be reconfigured. The trouble for teachers is how do you put this into practice? And so those are the kinds of ideas that I'm working with. And when I say gender identity complexity, it doesn't mean gender, it means the larger configuration of that term. And I also use agender when I use those terms. So gender and agender identity complexity.
Yeah, I think in answering that question, I would say that there's not necessarily a list of words I'm using or not using, but it depends on what the words populations I'm working with are using. One of the ways I might answer that question too is to offer the idea of being as specific and accurate as possible. So I review a lot of manuscripts where people talk about quote unquote LGBTQ populations, but they're really just talking about LGBTQ populations. And that is, well, I'm feeling generous today, so I'll say that it's particularly irritating when that happens. And so I would encourage people to be as specific as possible and be as clear as possible, right? If you're talking about trans people of color, I think that could be a good phrase to use if that's what you're doing, but I also wonder, what are the populations of color that you might be specifically focusing on, right? Are you talking about Black trans women, right? Are you talking about Indigenous and Two-Spirit trans people? So I think reflecting the words that communities alongside of whom you're working with is one particular way to do it. The other way to think about this is to be as specific as possible and to not just have the T become an empty signifier, which is what I've seen happen in a lot of spaces.
Yeah, and I think, Z, there was a tweet you sort of posted a while back around sort of not defining gender terminology and sort of the support of transhumanity. And I think that was really important to sort of see about the work that sort of LGBTQIA plus sort of scholars continue to have to do in naming ourselves into existence. And I was so appreciative of that, and just in thinking about the work that we do to sort of work with in naming sort of the folks we do research with. So for me, I was really sort of in awe of that. And so I love that. I just wanted to say that. But also just in thinking about one of the words that I'm really drawn to is E. Patrick Johnson's queer, as sort of a signifier of sort of queer is too white, and sort of drawing on sort of the African-American vernacular tradition of sort of queer, and drawing on AAVE as a way of reimagining what queer can be for the Black queer community has been really sort of powerful in my work, and thinking about where does queer fit into other sort of resource-based pedagogies that we have in educational research, and how does that sort of work or fit in. And so much of the impressive work that SJ is talking about also reminds me of thinking about how we come to name being human, and what is sort of the inhuman, and what are queer inhumanisms, and, you know, has the queer ever been human, right? And are these things that we can sort of come to name or work in naming? So those are sort of just some of the ideas that I'm having in terms of like the work that I want to put forward.
I guess the only thing that I would add is that I think more central to my way of thinking than listing off the ways that I talk about or write about gender and sex and gender identity specificity, I try to humble myself to the process of continual learning. And I'm thinking back to an essay that D.L. Stewart wrote several weeks ago about sort of the importance of we need to stay active in our own learning process. We need to humble ourselves to the knowledge that we don't have, and we need to commit ourselves to seeking it out and doing the work of learning about identities that are not our own and not familiar to us. And I think that his point about, you know, making
mark of being part of an ongoing lifelong active learning process. And from my way of thinking, that's the most important thing we can do, is to continually commit and recommit to learning, reading, and growing in our understanding of the diversity of genders and sexualities.
Thank you, Dr. Marine. I think you cut out just a little bit. I don't know if everybody wasn't able to hear that, but if you could repeat just a little bit of what you said right before you ended it out
Sorry,
again.
yeah, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. What I was saying is just the continual recommitment to learning, growing, and staying open to what we don't know, and what we need to continually kind of extend ourselves to learn more about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
And that's super relevant, considering I think a lot of us don't know this information. So we appreciate you for sharing these responses. To continue on, what do you believe is the current state of the LGBTQIA plus community in education? Do we feel like it's becoming more inclusive? Do we have a long ways to go? What are your thoughts on that?
Y'all, I'm feeling a little pessimistic. So like, maybe, I don't know, Susan's the one that always picks me up. So like, Susan, what do you think?
Yeah, Dr. Nicolazzo lovingly refers to me as Susie Sunshine sometimes. I mean, I'll just say that I'm not particularly optimistic at this moment. I've not only been deeply disheartened by the actions of our federal government, but also sort of the general apathy and silence of our professional associations around those commentaries, around those, you know, aggressive actions that are happening. And so right now I'm just wondering, where is leadership around validating and affirming our humanity, particularly the humanity of our trans and non-binary and genderqueer colleagues and students? And I just, I'd like to see more leadership on that front. That would make me feel more optimistic.
Yeah, and I'll say this too. I think that the narrative that you hear from folks that do LGBTQ work is all fairly similar for the most part. I mean, you heard it within what SJ said, what John said, and what Susan said, and it's the same for me too, right? This work is deeply personal and comes from our own commitments to our own communities. And while I think that that's important to have a lived experience, I also think it's really important that people who don't identify within the community also see this as their work too. I know that sometimes that might be controversial in certain groups, but I think to suggest that only queer people can do queer work is highly dangerous for a number of different reasons. And my current push and my current call for my own particular field is, where are the non-queer people doing queer work? And where are the non-queer people doing queer-based agitation? Clearly, we are not the only group that is under attack. We are not even the latest group under attack based on what's been happening today. And I think that we really need to figure out ways that we can be in solidarity with and across populations. And when I say that, I'm really thinking about the work of Dean Spade, who writes about this notion of trickle-up activism in his book, Normal Life, which if you haven't read that book yet, I really do think is required reading for people in education.
You know, I concur a lot with what Z said and what Susan said. I've been feeling pretty upset the past week, and especially the new GLSEN report that came out. I'm on the educators advisory committee for GLSEN, and we met last night. We meet virtually, and there are about, I think, 10 of us across the country. All of them, with the exception of me, are in the schools. So they're the ones doing the work that so many of you are, creating and really pushing. So I just want to say that there is a trickle down effect, even though, Z talked about the trickle up. Like, there's kind of this convergence of the two. We're here doing the work, the students are in the classroom doing that work, right? And GLSEN right now, which is I'm so excited about, they are not just picking up the LGBT, they are working really hard to make these intersections critical. They're about to push out an intersection of queer and disabilities, queer and autism, queer students of color, queer indigenous students. Like, they are busting places open that need to be opened. And so while I feel upset and concerned, when I look at what the advisory committee is doing and what GLSEN is taking on, they're going to continue to spatialize the work that they're doing. And I encourage you, if you haven't, look at the EAC GLSEN section on GLSEN, because they're putting out massive documents right now, and they'll continue to come out.
I'd also just sort of comment and close out with this question about sort of, this isn't representative of sort of the work or the people engaged in the work, on this panel. Like, I think of all of the sort of LGBTQIA people of color who are doing this work, like Ed Brockenbrough, Bettina Love, Lance McCready, as well as those two-spirited like Quolie Driscoll, who have also been engaging in this work. And I just want to say that because I know that, this was something I raised to the leadership team of, what does the visibility and representation of the folks on this panel look like? And how can we outright problematize that, in that, we have white-coded individuals here talking about these issues when they come to intersect quite differently for, children and youth of color, or, LGBTQIA folks of color holistically, right? And so I think that that's just important to also provide a lens to, that there are definitely a ton of other people who are doing this work and have been doing this work.
Thank you. Kind of going off of that, what do you all feel, what research still needs to be done to advance equity for the LGBTQIA plus community in education?
I guess all of it, right? There's so many crucial questions, I think, of LGBTQT plus involvement, inclusion, representation, visibility, safety, agency. I think one of the things maybe my fellow panelists might be able to relate to is the work feels so tremendously urgent, and it also feels so big that it's almost like we, in 30 lifetimes, will never have all the answers we need to make the entire pre-K 16 or sorry about that, or 20, sorry about that, environment in education fully inclusive and fully liberatory. I think that's what we're working for, right? We're not just trying to make our educational environments inclusive. We're actually trying to open up and broaden space so that we can think beyond the current practices that we engage in that I think many of us consider to be oppressive, limiting, and in many ways violent. So I think it's always that question of how can we keep pushing those borders of the work we're doing so that we get beyond just inclusion and we get to the real work of transformation.
Yeah, I'm going to try and blend Susan's response with what John just shared a little earlier and say that, yes, clearly there's always more that needs to be done. However, I also wonder how we can think about amplifying that work that has already been done, both inside and outside of the academy, particularly from Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, particularly from queer Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, right? I'm thinking about the activist and archivist work of Tourmaline, who's been doing a heck of a lot to make sure that we actually have our trans history and that we're able to hold on to our trans history. I'm also thinking about the work that that folks within, as John mentioned, within our field of education, as well as beyond education, have been doing to kind of hold on to who we are as queer and trans populations. And so I sometimes worry that the question about what has yet to be done is asked in a way that actually overlooks and doesn't engage with the work that has been done. And there's certainly, like I said, there's certainly more that can be done. Although, invoking D.L. Stewart again, he has been very clear that we can no longer say that there's a dearth of literature, particularly in higher education. And I know it's the same for K through 12 as well. And so I wonder, like, how is it that we use the research and amplify those voices who are most vulnerable and most on the margins in order to do the work of transformation?
Yeah, I think one of the things too, I can't agree more with what was just said, is like the work of Lal Zimin, who's looking at, language, right? The linguistics within trans and gender non-binary, speech patterns. And they're doing international work, which is phenomenal. And I think that's one thing that's missing in our field is we have so many groups that we're not attending to around the way that they do and don't use pronouns or aren't respectful because we're not knowledgeable. Because the question I always ask is, how do we know what we don't even know we should know? And so many different groups are using different types of languages. And it's not like this is nuanced to the United States. I mean, this is historically situated around the world, and we're missing that part in our own work. We see certain populations that are actually those terms like Latinx or being in Latin ampersand, which we can't even say, being more integrated, but where the other types of words that do and don't have pronouns, that do and don't conjugate, we know that language isn't translatable. I'm doing a study in Chile, and right now, queer doesn't exist. So terms don't translate equitably. So I think that's one thing that we should be mindful of. And I would like to see a growing population of everybody doing more respectful work around identity and language.
I mean, yes to all of that. I'm not going to sort of, I think that, I agree with what the other sort of panelists have said. And I think that, ultimately for me, I think that right now we need a sort of plan for structural transformation and accountability that sort of advances resistance to cis heteropatriarchy, right? I mean, that is something that I think we all could sort of think about and for, while still providing, the question of what do we do in times of terror, right? Like, and thinking about those stories of survivance. I think that those are, particularly sort of salient and pressing, but there's a fine line there around sort of like what you don't want are these pain narratives, which I think people mobilize and sort of stand on as a means to justify the work that they're doing.
So we're down to our last few questions. We wanted to ask about what accessible but critical resources do you suggest for those who want to become more familiar with this topic? And this can be anyone from grad students to practitioners to policymakers and so on and so forth.
I think I'll give it sort of a quick three. The first one is Harper Keenan's Letter to Trans Kids is a really beautiful resource that I use with my prospective teachers, as well as to the in-service educators I'm working with, who are sort of questioning what does it mean to sort of live and learn with gender non-binary youth and children. Z's Trans Studies in Higher Ed syllabus is a resource that I think is really, really wonderful. And I do want to sort of also shout out Reading the Rainbow by Jill Herman Wilmarth and Caitlin Ryan. I think it's a really great resource for elementary educators to sort of think about some of the issues in the ways in which literacy sort of restricts and silences rather than mobilizes and gives voice to LGBTQIA young people and young children at that.
You know, I'm thinking also about the work of the Queer to Prison Pipeline, and I'm thinking of the work of Erica Miners in particular, who, big shout out to, has done some amazing work and research about how youth of color and queer youth are ending up in those intersectionalities, especially, are ending up in school to prison and end up on the streets and foster care and homeless situations. And so I would say bringing some of their work into syllabi is really critical. Also, since I work with pre-service teachers, I do a ton of young adult literature. And I think, you know, young adult, regardless of your age, is really important because a lot of those narratives are written by authors who are working with students. So they're really generating the language right now. And how do we take up that language and those identities across the curriculum, across the school? Because those are really important resources. And we're seeing more and more of this work come out. The one area we're not seeing really talked about, and I've been doing an audit of the young adult texts coming that are actually out there, we see hardly any around asexuality at all. In my syllabus, I read a statement about the identities that are important, and that I just basically break it open and I name tons of identities in my space with my students, and I say, this is my accountability to you, and if I haven't recognized your identity, please let me know. But I say the term asexual, I use the word mental health, I use the word gender queer, and many of my students come to me and say they'd never heard their identity ever mentioned and intersex, in a classroom ever. And so the more I think we take up the language of those marginalized and invisibilized identities, I do think that the more people are going to feel empowered to actually take up that work. So besides asexuality, we hardly see any books written around intersex students.
I'll add a couple of anthologies or kind of like compiled works that I think are particularly important. Thanks, John, for mentioning the Trans Studies in Higher Ed syllabus. That is one space that folks can go to find lots of information from various different authors and activists. I would also encourage people to look for a special issue of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. It's volume 2, issue 3, and it's called Transformational Pedagogies, which Susan and I had the pleasure of co-editing with Francisco Galarte a number of years ago. And it has a lot of great resources. And also a recent special issue of Qualitative Studies in Education, which has also just been made now into a book. Please don't buy it individually. It's far too expensive, but get your college to buy it. And the special issue is called What's Transgressive About Trans Studies in Education Now, and has some of the most up-to-date higher education empirical literature that has been produced. We have data from two or three dissertations, the work of S. Simmons at the University of Chicago, TJ Jorian at Oakland University, who I believe is on this call as well. What up, TJ? And also work from Susan Marine, from Chase Catalano, from Kai Green, who's in Women and Gender Studies at Williams. So some really, really amazing resources that are in that compendium as well.
And I guess I'd just like to finish up with endorsing Dr. Nicolazzo's book, because I know that she won't do it, but it's a wonderful, wonderful resource, Trans in College, especially for understanding the specific experiences of trans students in higher education and the experiences of trans students of color in higher education in a really profound way. It's just a beautiful reflection on the challenges that we still have ahead of us. I'm currently reading C. Riley Snorton's book on Black on Both Sides, which is a wonderful sort of historiography of how racial identity figures into the story of Black trans people and racial histories and racialization. And I also want to give another plug for the amazing resources on the GLSEN website. When I'm helping my students understand these issues, I find those resources to be really among the best in terms of helping us map the terrain of educational experience. And unfortunately, I don't think we have a corollary right now in the higher ed world, an organization that's quite mapping those experiences as comprehensively as GLSEN is for the kind of pre-K-12 space. But I think I'm very hopeful that we'll get there in the near future.
Thank you so much for all of those resources. And I see that folks are also putting resources in the chat box, so feel free to go and grab them there. I think the plan is to get these resources out to everyone. So thank you so much. Speaking of the chat box, definitely go ahead and drop your questions in there. We're gonna get to them right after this last question from us. I know we saw a few in there, but if you have more questions, go ahead and type those in now. Okay, so finally, this is our constant final question for all of our guests when we do these webinars. We want to know what books, articles, poetry, literature, comics, graphic novels, whatever, are you reading right now? Please share them with us.
Whenever I am in a rut in terms of my own writing, when I feel like my writing has gotten overly formulaic, I'll tend to start reading fiction and memoirs as a way to try and think about different modes of writing. So I just finished a memoir last night called Killing It in Education. It's about a woman who leaves her job as a food reviewer for a magazine and learns how to become a butcher. I won't tell you anything more, but over break, if you want to read something fun, I would encourage you to read that. And also, also reading C. Riley Snorton's book, Black on Both Sides, with Susan and one of our other colleagues, Andres. We have a little reading group, which is kind of fun, keeps us up to speed with things. I also just finished a book by Tay Meadow, who's a sociologist at Columbia. The book is called Trans Kids Being Gendered in the 21st Century. And I think it's especially germane to folks doing work with trans youth. I will tell you that the subtitle is far more accurate about the book than the title. It's not a book that is about interviewing trans kids and hearing from kids, but is about the biopolitics of how children are gendered and how they have their agency around gender stripped through medical and psychiatric institutions. So a really thoughtfully done ethnographic text if folks are interested in work on trans youth.
I think two of the books that I'm sort of working with right now is, the first one is Anna Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. And I came to it from my former colleague, Jasmine Ulmer, around sort of, it's just a beautifully written book around sort of making complex ideas quite short and simple. And so I'm using it more as a mechanism to think about sort of the complexity of writing. But I also am just finishing up my colleague's beautiful book, Motherhood Across Borders, Gabby Oliveira's work. It's featured this quarter in NYU Press's Gender and Sexuality issue, but it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book that sort of thinks about the politics of motherhood and has, I think, a lot of ramifications in terms of rethinking the gendered ideals and constructs of what it means to be a mother. So I'd put that out there as well.
I'm reading a couple of things right now, but I grabbed this because it's sitting next to me. This is a wonderful book, Direct Action, Protest and the Reinvention of American Radicalism. It's not an education scholarship book, but I find my own thinking deeply informed by thinkers from other areas, disciplines, and and journalists. And this book has been just gripping, and I'm loving it. And it's kind of really the only thing I'm reading right now while I make my way across America in my car. So it's good stuff.
Well, I haven't slept much in the last 3 nights. And a friend of mine sent me Lin-Manuel Miranda's book, Good Morning, Good Night. You know, he was in Hamilton. And it's just about what you say to yourself in the morning and what you say to yourself when you go to bed at night. And I mean, I literally read it from 2 to 4:30 in the morning. And this is the first day I've actually felt some relief. So words of inspiration. I just read 2 YA novels that I absolutely loved. One is called Like Water, which is about a bisexual New Mexican that's both in Santa Fe and outside of Santa Fe, and it's just beautiful and very powerful. And the other one is by Meredith Rousseau, If I Was Your Girl, and it is one of the best YA books I've ever read, and part of it is because it's a trans narrative about a male to female that's really happy. And we see so much pain in so many of these stories, and I really appreciate the authors that are trying to flip the narrative and give students a positive sense of self-worth. And like I said, I see more of that coming out in YA, and I think even in our research we have to be mindful about, we know these harrowing narratives, and we don't want to continue to repeat those narratives. I think it's, like Z said, a lot of this work is, you know, we're coming from a similar place of pain and trauma, but how do we change those narratives to do positive identity development? And I think that's really a challenge for many of us. Oh, and I'm reading Entertainment Weekly.
Okay, so that's very, and I love that we can end on that note there. We're actually going to transition now to questions from our chat box from folks that have joined us. And the first one comes from Jenny, and she was wondering about the term queer inhuman. She says it's not something, or Jenny says it's not something that they are familiar with. Can we please unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So I shared the resource in the chat. It actually is a special issue that Chen sort of did in conjunction with a colleague around queer inhumanisms. It was actually one of the last pieces that the late Jose Esteban Munoz contributed to, but it really sort of takes up this question that Sylvia Winter puts forth around sort of, you know, what does it mean to be human for those of us who have been never marked legible as human? And I think through a variety of theoretical frameworks and lenses, from anything from sort of intersectionality, affect, to sort of feminist new materialisms, this issue thinks through what is it, you know, how do we sort of complicate queer as something that is and has always been the inhuman or subhuman, or the queer as something that vacillates from this human inhuman status. So I'd point sort of there as a resource to go into, because it really has sort of shifted my thinking about the ways in which we qualify the human in empirical research.
Well, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that you're talking about this makes me think of Alexander Wahaley's work, particularly his work Habeas Viscus. And so I'm thinking about this notion of, right, like if we think about the notion of queer inhuman to be kind of a necropolitical move that thinks about who's human, who's not quite human, and who's non-human. And we think of the queer as always either not quite human or non-human. Then what possibilities exist for how we move forward with that, right? If kind of coming into our queer and transness is a movement towards like death in many different ways, then what does it mean to come together as a population? What does it mean to live and exist queer in real time, as well as in digital time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And another resource that, you know, for folks interested in this, Justin Adams Burton has a beautiful book called Posthuman Rap that sort of critiques Jane Bennett, Rosie Braidotti, and Karen Barad, and sort of says, you know, for those of you interested in thinking about the inhuman as this materialist function, you know, what happens when we sort of think about the inhuman as I just lost my train of thought. But it sort of critiques this sort of queer as this idea of, queer according to sort of white Western liberal humanism, right? Is this subject that for many folks of color, they could never attain in the first place. So what does it mean to complicate that?
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is from VC, and it says, how can quantitative researchers improve their work with gender and sexuality? For example, breaking out of the gender binary, reporting small sample sizes, and so on.
So I cannot, as a qualitative researcher, do some of this answering. What I will suggest is that there's a forthcoming edited volume called Starting with Gender in International Higher Education. It's being put together by myself and Emily Henderson, one of my colleagues who works at the University of Warwick in England. And there's a lovely chapter that is being written, is being published by Michael Woodford, Zach Marshall, and Jessica Jocelyn in that volume that asks this very question. I also would encourage people to look at, again, TSQ Transgender Studies Quarterly, Volume 1, Issue 3, I believe, called Making Transgender Count, which is all about the pitfalls and barriers and nuances and difficulties with trying to capture and quantify a category that has no boundaries by design. So yeah, those are some resources that I would encourage people to check out.
I too feel fairly underqualified to respond effectively to that question, but I will mention a resource that I have found really important in my own understanding of what it looks like in practice when people do better around creating categorical inclusion and things like that. And that is the AAU campus survey on, I think they call it sexual misconduct. I would call it sexual violence. It came out in 2015, and it's a really nice example of a large organization making a very earnest and I think good effort to create categories for study of important phenomenon that are gender inclusive and in fact capture a much broader sample and population as a result. It's not perfect, but they did an excellent job. And this study showed us pretty definitively that trans, genderqueer, and non-binary students have a higher incidence of sexual violence during their time in college than cisgender women. And that is a absolutely groundbreaking thing to be able to both document and then address. And were it not for their diligent work, I think we would have missed that. And it's a really, really important thing for us to be thinking and learning about. So I would point to that as an example of good, if imperfect, work.
A colleague of mine from NYU, if you don't know Joseph Simpian's work, it's brilliant. I highly recommend that you go on his website. He does quantitative research on what's called miscellaneous identifiers. And these are youth that are actually troubling, like when the students take these, like, what categories are you, what grade, what are your demographics? These are youth that are actually misidentifying themselves on purpose and are like skewing data. So whoever's doing the research out there on that, I would recommend that you look at his website. He is the current AERA gender and equity I guess you would call it chair. He's got a piece coming out right now called Bias from Potentially Mischievous Responders on Large-Scale Estimates of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, or Questioning Heterosexual Youth and Health Disparities. He also has one on gender equity in college majors, looking beyond the STEM and non-STEM dichotomy, etc. So his work is really brilliant, classification errors, and he's mostly on huge grants like NIH grants and other federal grants. So shout out to Joseph.
Thank you. So I will ask one more audience question, and that's, it's a good one. I was actually wondering this myself. What are some of the tensions or challenges that you face as faculty researching queer issues, and how do you deal with them?
Look, colleges of education are highly normative spaces, right? They were called normal schools, and some still are for a very particular reason. And that's to really think about standardization and normalization as actual practices that colleges of education produce and reproduce. That being said, I think that the challenges and tensions that I experience can be anticipated, right? Like, you know, one of the things that I experienced in my previous job was that they wanted me at first as a critical scholar and as a critical gender scholar. And then I think over a couple of years, the kind of kitschiness of my criticality became difficult to deal with, right? And so for people who are critical scholars, for people that ask critical questions that are constantly posing problems, to use Sarah Ahmed's words, around issues of race, gender, sexuality, disability, we then become posed as the problem. Again, kind of parroting Dr. Ahmed's work. And that's exactly what I think lots of us experience. It's not just me, right? I mentioned that I'm doing some work with trans and gender nonconforming faculty currently, and I know that that's something that these faculty participants that I'm working with are also experiencing. I also think that the academy, well, I know the academy can be a deeply lonely place. The way that departments are set up is to get one of everything, right? Like one person who does this type of work, one person who does this type of work, one person who has these particular identities to create a well-rounded department. And that means that we need to develop kinship and community that extends beyond our departments and beyond our universities. And that's sometimes really difficult, especially for people who are pre-tenure and are really trying to work to secure their livelihoods, as well as for folks who are post-tenure and have already been disciplined in particular ways, right? So I think that those are some of the challenges that I've been trying to think through in terms of the work that I'm doing and kind of where I'm at. I also think that I tend to be very lucky in the sense that I'm a part of a transgender studies initiative, which isn't really the case. I have a trans studies specific education position, which doesn't really happen. And I'm now surrounded by a group of colleagues who are all deeply critical about moving education in liberatory directions, which again, is not always common.
Yeah, I think that, you know, my challenges are unique, you know, to an institution and to sort of me personally, but I think one of the sort of hallmarks that I've tried to sort of foster both here at Boston College, but also at my previous institution, is to develop those queer kin networks of, you know, are there spaces where I'm sort of encountering others that have sort of other activist and political agendas that sort of push and advance sort of what we mean by the whole person in social justice at this institution, but also what are the sort of diverse networks and communities that I'm a part of in the broader city of Boston, where, you know, at different sort of in different spaces where they may be doing it better than my institution. So I think that that's sort of the one of the first things I'd sort of suggest in thinking about that, but with sort of understanding that, you know, I was a former primary grades educator. And as sort of my research continues, I'm becoming more and more drawn to sort of enter and go back into elementary school spaces. So it's an interesting sort of issue of, you know, even, you know, despite sort of being, you know, cis presenting and white coded, what does it mean to sort of have sort of a queer researcher in a sort of primary grades classroom? What does that do? And fortunately, I've been able to meet really fabulous sort of queer educators, queer elementary educators who have sort of said, you know, let's actually figure that out together. So I think that that's been a great sort of sense of humanity and for me here.
But thank you all so much again. Thank you everyone, especially to our participating scholars. Again, Doctors Susan Marine, Dr. S.J. Miller, Dr. Z. Nicolazzo, and Dr. John Wargo, and to all of you for engaging in this conversation. I know we're just scratching the surface, and we hope to continue this conversation with each other and in our work. But hopefully with this dialogue, we can be more aware of humanizing our research and moving towards a more socially just and liberating reality. So before we close out, we've got some plugs for you, so just bear with me. For more information on today's speakers, including citation information and some of their recent publications, please visit the AER Division G blog on WordPress. If you have any ideas about webinar topics, we definitely want to serve you all as our community. So go ahead and enter that into the chat box for us. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook for updates on our monthly webinars and other Division G related news. Coming up in November, we'll be hosting a webinar with scholar mentors about the pre-conference session at the AERA annual meeting in Toronto. The pre-con is on April 5th, and it's titled Paths of Purpose and Inner Peace. And Dr. Lee Patel will be the keynote speaker. So we're looking forward to that. And again, thank you all for supporting this AERA Division G webinar, and we'll see you next time.